So this next portion is a history of the land and its people. And the purpose of this segment is to give a modern historical context for this class and what's going on in Israel and Palestine. That is the land, the geography of Palestine and Israel, and the people who live on it. And I say modern historical context to distinguish it from ancient history. And here's what I mean by that. When I was 16 years old, I read an article in Time magazine that talked about the modern state of Israel. And I didn't know what that meant. Is there an old-fashioned state of Israel? And, looking back, I realized how completely ignorant I was of 20th century reality. I was raised Catholic Christian, and for me, Israel was where the Israelites lived. And Palestine was, well, Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, but I really didn't know what that meant. Everything I knew back then was based on an ancient biblical narrative that was 2,000 years old. And my knowledge was just so partial and out of date. So this presentation is on more recent geopolitical history, the last century and a half. I will show a short video, and that will be followed up with a PowerPoint showing some maps. And there will be time at the end of this segment for some questions, so please hold your questions till the end of the PowerPoint. So the video, we're going to start with that. It's just 7 minutes. And the video will be a very helpful introduction to the situation in Israel, Palestine. I realize there's lots of people here with all kinds of varying experience. This is introductory. The video is created by Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP. JVP is a US-based organization that's dedicated to a US foreign policy in the Middle East that's based on human rights and international law. And it's a very good introduction for us for this evening and for the class.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges. including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land, while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do, but the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
They pack a lot into 7 minutes. Now I'm going to do a screen share of a PowerPoint presentation. So, a history of the land and people. This PowerPoint will have maps and dates to help us understand the modern historical context of the land and its people. Let's go back about 1.5 centuries. In the mid-1800s, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. So on the map, here's the Mediterranean Sea, and the Ottoman Empire is the dark brown. Here's Palestine. And Palestine was inhabited by Palestinians. And they were referred to as Arabs because they all spoke Arabic. About 85% were Muslim, 11% were Christian, and 4% were Jews. Meanwhile, in Europe, as the video pointed out, Jews were a persecuted people. There was widespread discrimination and maltreatment, and they became increasingly vocal about finding a Jewish homeland. In World War I, the Ottomans sided with Germany and, of course, lost, and the Middle East was divided up among the victors. During World War I, the British took a position on a Jewish homeland. In what became known as the Balfour Declaration, British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour wrote, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." In other words, Britain was putting their weight behind it. In World War I, after World War I, the Allies divvied up the Middle East, and in 1918, Palestine became a British colony under military rule. In 1920, the League of Nations legitimized British control and declared the British Mandate for Palestine. So if you look on the map, here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, and the British Mandate was made up of two parts. To the west of the Jordan River was Palestine, and to the east of the Jordan River was Transjordan. And this is how things stood between the two world wars. Palestine and Transjordan were British colonies. After World War I, Transjordan declared its independence from Britain and renamed itself Jordan. So Palestine now referred to the land west of the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And this piece of land was up for grabs, and the question of Palestine became a big international issue. The newly formed United Nations drew up a plan, and Palestine was partitioned into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with 56% of the land designated for a Jewish state and 44% for an Arab state. So on the map, this blue part was what was to be a Jewish state, and this tan or gray was to be an Arab state, with Jerusalem and the area around it to be separately administered by international bodies. In 1948, the British pulled out of Palestine, and Israel declared itself a nation. This is the modern state of Israel. And for Jews, this was a euphoric moment, but for Arabs in the region, it was not. And it was vehemently disputed. They disputed the modern state of Israel's right to exist, and war broke out. This was Israel's war of independence, which it fought with its neighboring Arab states. In 1949, when fighting was over, Israel controlled 78% of the land of Palestine, and Arabs controlled only 22%. So on the map, Israel became the blue part plus the purple part, and Arabs controlled the Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Egypt, this kidney-shaped thing, which is the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is what right here. So West Jerusalem is in Israel, and East Jerusalem is in the West Bank. So Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And that's how things remained until 1967. In 1967, in a swift move with high military capability, Israel fought a war in just 6 days with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It was a decisive victory, and Israel took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and they also took the Golan Heights from Syria. This is when the military occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel began. So let's review. What are the Palestinian territories? They're the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. This is generally acknowledged internationally as the occupied Palestinian territories. Where is Israel? That's a little harder. It's the purple, but also if you were to look at any Israeli map, they would also include the Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Where is the green line? You may have heard that expression. The green line basically is the 1949 ceasefire lines around the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Where is the wall or the security fence? Well, it's built completely around Gaza, and it's also around, not entirely, but around large portions of the West Bank. Not entirely, but also the wall sometimes cuts deeply into the West Bank so that land ends up on Israel's side. Where are the checkpoints? The checkpoints, many of them are along the wall, but also checkpoints are inside the West Bank in East Jerusalem, anywhere Israel wants to put them. Where are the settlements? The settlements are in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Where do Jewish Israelis live? They live in Israel, and they also live in the settlements throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Where do Palestinians live? They live in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. They also live inside Israel as citizens of Israel, and many of them live in neighboring countries and other places as immigrants. So to wrap up this segment on the history of land, one more visual. The video said that Israel redrew the map, and this page says it well. On these 4 maps, the green represents Palestinian land and the white represents Jewish land. The first map shows how things were in 1945 after World War II. The second map is 1947, which shows the UN partition plan. The third map is 1949 after the ceasefire of Israel's War of Independence. And the fourth map shows from 1967 onward, basically after the 6 Days War until today. Over the course of the last few decades, there has been a complete reversal of who controls the land. So hopefully the video, the maps, the dates provide some background context for tonight and for the program over the next few weeks. So we have time for questions. So regarding the land and dates, are there any questions that people have?
We can take a few questions. If you would put there, raise your hand, and it'll show up in the top left of my Zoom screen.
So
Any
Alex?
questions for Winnie?
Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, are clarifications appropriate or just questions?
Well, sure. I mean, is clarification on the land and dates and sort of this historical.
Yeah. I think it's really important. It's correct that the War of Independence, as Israel calls it, started after the formation of the state in May of 48. But I think it's important for people to know that the fighting actually started immediately after the UN resolution passed in November of 47. Yeah. And that there are already 300,000 refugees before the British left and before Israel declared a state. And a lot of the history has to do with where you start the clock. And if you start the clock on the day that Israel declared itself a state, that's when the Arab armies moved in. But before that, with the 300,000 refugees of Palestine, there were no Arab armies in the territory. And so I think that's an important context. So anyway, thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is a very brief overview, and there's all kinds of color commentary that can be added here. Yes, thanks, Alex. Louise? You need to take yourself off mute. You're on mute.
Can you say again what the green line is?
Yeah, the green line is, I don't hear that phrase as much lately, but it's basically the ceasefire lines after 1949. So around the Gaza Strip and around the West Bank.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions?
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Right, thanks, Andy.
Kathy, and then followed by Winnie. Kathy's going to present the narrative from the Zionist and Jewish point of view. And she gave us a quick glimpse already of her transformation. And then Winnie will speak to the Palestinian narrative. So Kathy, thank you.
Okay, I apologize in advance if I have to stop and cough or blow my nose. I'm getting over a cold. So, Israel today is a Jewish state. It came about because of an ideology, Zionism, that advocates the creation of a Jewish homeland, a sovereign Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. The narrative I want to tell you about is not a Jewish narrative or an Israeli narrative. It is a Zionist narrative. It is a story central to European Jewish Israeli imagination. There have been many Zionist narratives. The one that won out was proposed in 1897 by Austro-Hungarian journalist Theodor Herzl. He was responding to the Jewish question, the plight of Jews at the time of the anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire. This was sparked by the Dreyfus affair, in which a Jewish French officer was accused and convicted of treason. Herzl concluded that Jewish people could not be safe anywhere. His political movement sought to encourage Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine. This is a story of enslavement, exile, and reclamation of land by Jewish people. It's not my personal story, but it was taught to me as I grew up. It is useful for me to try to step into it with you. I invite you to listen as if it is my story. So here's my brief summary. As Jews, we left our ancestral land and went to live in major cities in Europe and elsewhere and prospered. Then the tide shifted throughout much of Eastern Europe, and Jews were persecuted by the dominant cultures. There were restrictions on where we could live, what occupations we could hold, where and what we could study, and we were forcibly evicted from our homes. Often we had no time to pack our possessions and were forced to leave everything behind. The vision of a Jewish state, a national homeland in Palestine, provided a solution. We believed we were a people without a land, and this was a land without a people. We desperately needed a place to be safe and live normal lives. We bought land in Palestine through the Jewish Agency and began to develop industry and agriculture. After the Nazi atrocities came to light, the world agreed we needed a Jewish state. The United Nations declared Israel a Jewish state in 1948. We now had a homeland. American Jews sent money to help us plant forests and start our lives over. Israel became a home and a vibrant center for Jewish culture. Jews all over the world came to visit and live. We are mostly safe, but we must be ever vigilant because we are surrounded by Arab countries who seek to destroy us. Our security is our major concern. Now the unabridged version, so you can get a sense of our ancient narrative. In the Old Testament, God gave the land of biblical Israel to Abraham. He made a covenant forever with the Jewish people. Jewish people were once slaves in Egypt. After that, God gave the Jewish people the Torah at Mount Sinai and led us to the promised land. Then in 470 BCE, we were expelled from Jerusalem, exiled to Babylonia, but returned to the land approximately 120 years later. Then the second temple was built by Solomon, and there was a glorious kingdom where Judaism thrived. But then there was the Roman conquest, and Jews were driven into exile. The temple was destroyed, but some Jews stayed. Always we kept alive the longing to return to the Holy Land, and that's why we pray toward Jerusalem we've been praying towards Jerusalem for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, Jews have been hated and victimized, blaming for the killing of Christ. There's been Christian persecution, including the pogroms, the Inquisition, and massacres wherever we go. European Jewish culture was obliterated. Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. And then in an effort to remove Jews from Russia, the Russian Jews were herded to the Pale of Settlement in 1791. when Jews were scapegoated by the Tsar. In response to this, in the late 1870s, Jewish philanthropists sponsored agricultural settlements for Russian Jews in Palestine. The Jews who migrated in this period were known as the first Aliyah. They were the first wave of immigration to Palestine in 1882. Aliyah is the Hebrew word meaning ascent, referring to the act of spiritually ascending to the Holy Land and a basic tenet of Zionism. Between 1882 and 1902, these Jews were fleeing, for the most part, the pogroms and anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia and the Ukraine. The stateless Jewish population of Eastern and Central European people began to consider a return to our homeland and to rebuild our country as our own national home and refuge. Remember, I mentioned Theodor Herzl? In 1897, Herzl held the first Zionist Congress in Basel, and declared their national home should be in Palestine. Then came the second Aliyah. There were widespread pogroms accompanied the 1905 Russian Revolution. The vicious pogroms led to a wave of immigrants to Palestine. This new wave expanded the revival of the Hebrew language. In 1909, a group of 65 Zionists laid the foundations for a modern city in Palestine. The city was named after the Hebrew title of Herzl's book, The Old New Land, Tel Aviv. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was a letter from Arthur Balfour, a member of England's Parliament and a prominent representative of British Jewry, on the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration recognized the validity and justice of the Jewish claim to the land. When World War I was over in 1929, the League of Nations mandated control of Palestine to the British. This was known as the British Mandate. But in the 1920s, riots by Arabs hostile to Jewish presence on the land tried to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine. But the movement expanded with the third and fourth Aliyahs. The period of from 1919 to 1923 saw a migration of Jews escaping the civil war in Russia. Then the period of from 1924 to 1929 saw migration by Jews escaping anti-Semitic regimes in Poland and Hungary. By 1928, nations limited Jewish immigration. We were perceived as a threat to their political stability, as if we would bring revolutionary political ideas, and we were perceived as being a negative moral influence on society. Then came the rise to power of Adolf Hitler in Germany in 1933, which produced a powerful impetus for increased Zionist support and immigration to Palestine. The long-held assimilationist and non-Zionist views that Jews could live securely as minorities in Europe's societies was deeply undermined, since Germany had been regarded previously as the country in which Jews had been most successfully integrated. With nearly all other countries close to Jewish immigration, a new wave of migrants headed for Palestine. And then came the final solution in 1942, when 6 million Jews were gassed and put in ovens. Christians allowed the Nazi Holocaust to happen because of Jew hatred. No country would take the Jews. There was no place in Europe that Jews could be safe. In 1945, there were millions of displaced persons with nowhere to go. The creation of the State of Israel happened because the world community came together at the UN and agreed that Jews are a people who deserve a nation like all other peoples. What was offered after genocide was partition and the chance to build a country. Immediately after partition was voted in by the UN in November 1947, Arabs declared war on Israel, and the Arab armies of a dozen Arab countries attacked. In 1948 was a war of independence against the armies of all Arab countries. Arab chieftains told villagers to run away, and they didn't defend their homes. There were 25 Arab countries the indigenous people could go to, and we had nowhere to be safe. Arabs have never accepted the Jewish state and have been doing terrorist violence and killing innocents since 1948. The land was an empty swamp. Native people did not take care of the land. Jewish initiative, perseverance, and labor drained the swamps and made the desert bloom. Jews brought modern civilization and culture to the Middle East. In 1967, the Arabs viciously attacked but were vanquished by the heroic Israeli army in 6 days. Since 1967, the Arabs have been a constant threat to Israel's civilian population. Israel has endlessly pursued peace. Israel offers negotiations, including incredibly generous concessions. The Arabs give nothing and reject all overtures. Today, the world is still against the Jews. Anti-Semitism is widespread and dangerous. The Jewish people must have a state of their own if we are ever going to be safe. Israel is a home for Jews, a modern and vibrant center for Jewish culture. But we must be ever vigilant because Israel is surrounded by countries who seek to destroy us, and around the world, anti-Semitism is still widespread and dangerous. The Jewish people must have a state of our own if we are ever going to be safe. Israel unilaterally gave up the Gaza Strip in 2005, and the only response was thousands of rockets launched into civilian neighborhoods from Hamas. The Hamas charter calls for the destruction of Israel, funded and supplied by the government of Iran, which denies the Nazi Holocaust happened and is bent on the destruction of Israel. Arabs will not negotiate and do not want peace. There is no partner for peace. Security measures in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the wall and checkpoints, are necessary for the Jewish security against terrorist attacks. Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. Arabs in Israel are its citizens and vote, but won't accept that Israel is a Jewish state. And above all else, throughout history, the Jewish people have been despised, brutalized, and exiled. We only want what other people in the earth has, what every other people on the earth has, safety and security in our own home, in a country of our own. Thank you.
Very intense, Kathy, and thank you for voicing that history and that side of the opinions. Winnie is going to present the Palestinian narrative. Winnie, thanks for doing this tonight.
So I will offer a response to the Zionist narrative. I will offer a Palestinian narrative. I'm not Palestinian. This is not my story, but I will speak as if it were my story. I had the opportunity to live and work in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, and I made many Palestinian friends. This is their story. I will be their voice. If a narrative is a story, when does the Palestinian story begin? Who are Palestinians? Palestine, as a geographic term, has been around since about 500 BCE, and it stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River and beyond. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. He lived in Palestine alongside Palestinian non-Jews. In the 1st century, when Christianity took hold, some Palestinians became Christians. These were the first Palestinian Christians. In the 7th century, Arabic-speaking Muslims arrived in Palestine, and some Palestinians became Muslims. Eventually, all inhabitants of Palestine, regardless of religion, came to be Arabic speakers. In the 11th century, the Crusades brought more Christians, and they intermarried, and some Muslims became Christians. Today, Palestinians are defined by geography, they're from Palestine, by language, they speak Arabic, and by religion, Muslim and Christian. Palestinians have been living in Palestine for centuries and centuries. So this thing about a land without a people is not true. Our Palestinian narrative has ancient roots. At the beginning of the 20th century, Palestine was inhabited overwhelmingly by Muslims and Christians. Only 6% were Jews. Palestine and most of the Middle East were under the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and we were cogs in the Ottomans' imperial machine. In World War I, the Ottomans sided with Germany. Remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia? In 1914, British diplomat Lawrence tried to persuade us Arabs to support the Allies, and the inducement from the British was that after the war, there would be the creation of a large Arab state. And that sounded good to us, and Arabs fought with the British. But what we didn't realize is that we were just pawns of the British imperial machine. 3 years later, in 1917, the British were making other plans with the Jewish community in Britain. The Balfour Declaration states that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and that the British will use their best efforts to facilitate the achievement of this object. How could this be? Another country was promising our land to European Jews. And once again, we were pawns of imperial manipulation. In 1918, Germany and Ottomans lost the war. And this led to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And the promised large Arab state did not come to fruition. Some Arab nations were formed: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. But for Palestinian Arabs, it was heartbreak. It was dispossession. The world superpower played with our homeland in a geopolitical chess game of imperial arrogance. A foreign power promised our land to another people. In 1920, the League of Nations gave control of Palestine and Jordan to the British. This was the British mandate. Palestine was a British colony, subjected to all the indignities of colonial aggression. And like countless colonized people in the 20th century, we desired nationhood and self-determination. As World War II approached, another form of colonization of Palestine began by other Europeans, this time Jews, Zionist Jews, cityfied Westerners who, like all Western colonizers, thought themselves superior to the indigenous population, and in their arrogance saw themselves as civilizing Arab natives. This is thinly disguised racism. They didn't develop agriculture and make the desert bloom. We taught them. At first, Zionist settlers lived peacefully with us in our land of Palestine, but as time went by, we could see their shameless ambition. These colonizers, Zionist Jews, weren't here to exploit our natural resources. They were here to stay. This is different from the colonialism of the Ottomans or the British. This is settler colonialism. They came to live on our land and claim it as their own. Americans are familiar with this from their own history of dispossessing Native Americans. And there's a similarity between these two stories. Both of these colonizing forces saw themselves as having a God-given right. In Palestine, they claimed to be a chosen people with a land deed from God. In America, they claimed a manifest destiny. In 1947, the UN partitioned Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, giving more than half the land to the Jews. Foreign-born Zionist colonizers accepted, of course they would, but we native-born Palestinians rejected it, and why wouldn't we? If strangers moved into your house and claimed the first floor as their own, would you accept it? We didn't either. And besides, why should we pay for what the Europeans did to the Jews? In 1948, Zionist aggressors declared the State of Israel, and the UN, in a disastrous vote, recognized Israel. Arabs were understandably furious. We did not accept Israel's right to exist by taking Arab land, and war broke out. In 1949, when the war was over, the Zionists had seized even more land from Palestinians, and we were left with just 22%, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In the Zionist narrative, we heard about the War of Independence and the birth of a nation. But for the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, a catastrophe. What was this catastrophe? The Zionist colonizers took our land. Their nation destroyed our aspirations of nationhood. We faced the systematic expulsion of our people from our ancient homeland. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said, quote, "The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as war," end quote. The war was a cover for the massacre of Palestinian civilians. In the new state of Israel, we experienced the ethnic cleansing of the non-Jewish population. We were driven out of our towns and off our land and forced to flee in terror. More than 500 Palestinian towns and villages were wiped off the map by the Zionists. Now, who's trying to destroy whom? Between 1947 and 1949, 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. Many of us moved to the Gaza Strip. A few went to the West Bank. Some moved elsewhere within Israel. Many were forced to flee and became immigrants in neighboring countries and around the world. We were all driven out with no compensation, never allowed back, no right of return. This is a clear violation of UN statements on human rights. Many Westerners probably know little about these events. Sure, Americans know about the Holocaust, but nothing about the Nakba, the catastrophe. But for Palestinians, the Nakba is iconic. It was a time of numerous documented war crimes and widespread human rights abuses. In 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War with neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, and took control of the remaining 22% of Palestinian land through overwhelming military force. Americans are well acquainted with overwhelming displays of military force, and thus began the military occupation of the Palestinian territories. Israel established military rule in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In 2005, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, which became an open-air prison because it is completely surrounded by a 30-foot concrete wall, which creates what is described by the UN as a humanitarian crisis, which continues to this day. For Palestinians in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, for the past 55 years, military occupation has been our oppressive reality. Military occupation probably are just words to people in America, but for us Palestinians, military occupation means the seizure of our land through Israeli settlements, Jewish-only roads, and the apartheid wall. It means economic strangulation resulting from restricted movement caused by checkpoints and roadblocks. It means we have severely limited access to water and other natural resources. Do you know we're not allowed to drill a well on our own land unless we get a permit from Israel, which they rarely grant? It means a two-tier legal system, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. This is blatant Jim Crow style laws. There's mass incarceration of Palestinians, including children. It means a brutality of daily life. We are murdered with impunity at the hands of officers of the law. The imprisonment of Gaza and the military occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem are ever-present grinding realities in the lives of Palestinians. This is not about Israel's security. It's intended to humiliate us Palestinians and drive us out. This is collective punishment of an entire population, and it is illegal according to international law. Today, where does this leave us? Palestinians are a subjugated people who for centuries have suffered under the weight of empire, colonialism, and racism. Our human rights are trampled on daily. And nowadays, with Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment so widespread, it's hard to get the attention or the sympathy of the world. But we say Palestinian lives matter. For more than a century, we Palestinians have paid the price for Zionist, racist, colonial aggression. We've paid with our land, our aspiration for nationhood, our freedom, and our lives. And it's not that the world doesn't care. The world is largely unaware. There is a dominant narrative about the Zionist narrative about the birth of the state of Israel, a story which until recently was almost universally accepted, especially by Western Christians. And this imbalance of understanding is itself a barrier to any real peace. I invite you to a better understanding of Palestine. I invite you to see the Palestinian struggle for human rights in the context of international law and other global struggles for social justice. We Palestinians want only what every person on earth deserves, a respect of our human rights and a country where we can live in peace.
Thank you, Winnie. Really wonderful job of going through both the history, but also the themes that are going to keep coming back to us, friends, as we go through the next 6 nights. Tonight's a lot of listening, so I appreciate all of you sticking with us. Our next segment is the Christian responses that have come in the follow-up to both the Zionist narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And we appreciate that Cliff Cutler, longtime friend of Christian Jewish Allies and host at St. Paul's up in Chestnut Hill, that group for the longest time. Cliff is going to take us through some of the Christian responses.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.
Thank you. In my 1996 visit to Israel, Palestine, I was part of an ecumenical clergy group of 40. Sunday was an unscheduled day for us. One of the women in clergy had been told of a person by the name of Naima Teek, who would be preaching at St. George's Cathedral in East Jerusalem. A Palestinian priest, he would offer an alternative view of Israel and Palestine. 3 of us attended the worship in Arabic. Father Atik translated as he went along. Afterwards, he graciously invited us to join a small base community Bible study. Base community is originally named for Comunidades de Base, pardon my Spanish, in Latin American liberation theology. Naima Teek wrote the classic Justice and Only Justice, a Palestinian theology of liberation, in 1989. The title is a quote from the biblical book of Deuteronomy, which, as Atik explains, means justice for all. The interpretive key to the Bible, he says, is the person of Jesus, who in his first sermon quotes the prophet Isaiah in the call to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Palestinian liberation theology reveals God's uncompromising concern for justice. Whenever injustice occurs, God intervenes to defend the poor. Finally, Atik pleads for justice with mercy. He says for Palestinians, Psalms 42 and 43 have special significance. First, God hears the cry of the oppressed. Secondly, Palestinians live in trust and hope. And finally, trust and hope in God. With trust and hope in God, the outcome, though not visible, is assured. Naima Teek shared with us his fear of the evangelical influence of the Christian right. This, at the time, struck me as odd. The moral majority had disbanded in 1989. The Christian right, to my mind, was in decline. I was wrong. In 1997, Bibi Netanyahu keynoted a massive rally organized by Jerry Falwell, protesting then-President Bill Clinton's attempt to pressure Israel into withdrawing from settlements on the West Bank. 10 years after my first meeting with Naima Teek, Texas megachurch televangelist John Hagee founded the Christian Zionist organization Christians United for Israel. Today, they boast over 10 million members who believe the modern state of Israel is part of God's plan for salvation. The state of Israel began with the 1948 war, as you've heard. Christian Zionists saw the restoration of the land to Israel as a theologically ordained, awe-inspiring event, literally fulfilling Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. For Christian Zionists, this heralded the beginning of Earth's final age or dispensation, known as the millennial reign of Christ. Then in 1967, East Jerusalem, along with the Temple Mount, were captured in what is known as the Six-Day War. This preemptive war took place from June 5th through the 10th, without Israel even having to miss a Sabbath. Another fulfilled prophecy seemed evidence of a coming triumphal Christ in this final dispensation. The prophet Zechariah chapter 8. Thus says the Lord, I will return to Zion and dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts shall be called the holy mountain. Some Christian Zionists saw in this an end-time prophecy in which the building of the third temple and consequent destruction of Muslim holy sites on the Temple Mount would lead to an apocalyptic war that would pave the way for Christ's second coming. In 2008, I joined our friend Joan Broadfield and others in a compassionate listening delegation to Israel and the occupied territories. In Hebron, a Palestinian Muslim family invited me and another from our group to dinner. Afterwards, they called some friends over to join us. Knowing that I was a Christian priest, I asked, do Christians believe that the temple must be rebuilt in Jerusalem for there to be a second coming? No, I replied. Jesus' second coming is not about a rebuilt temple, but a renewed world. However, in their land, and too often in ours as well, the Christian message has become a Christian Zionist manifesto of Christ's second coming as that of a triumphal God who dashes in pieces those who stand in the way. Christian Zionism bases its authority not just on a final dispensation, but also on a covenant, particularly God's covenant with Abraham. The words of God, I will bless those who bless you, are taken to mean unequivocal support for the state of Israel. Christian Zionists maintain two covenants coexisting, the covenant with Abraham and the new covenant of Jesus Christ. God's Abrahamic covenant continues to this day, supportive of the modern state of Israel. Any deviation from this understanding of our Abrahamic covenant is called replacement theology. Jewish claims are replaced by the triumph of Christian ones. A more mainstream theology is that God does not replace a covenant, but expands it. A dual covenant is not necessary. Despite Abraham being the father of a multitude of nations, love is elastic. It can stretch. There's no need to posit two covenants when God's compassion can widen to include all. Christian Zionism doesn't just come in a fundamentalist imperial Christianity. One may also see it in the mainline churches. Don Wagner writes, mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic Christian Zionism supports the Zionist movement and views modern Israel as the answer to the Nazi Holocaust and anti-Semitism, thus guaranteeing the Jewish people an independent Jewish state in historic Palestine with unconditional political, moral, and religious support. Jewish theologian Mark Ellis coined the phrase the ecumenical deal to describe the mainline churches, politicians, media, and the Academy, who suddenly grow silent about Palestinian rights at the request of their Jewish Zionist friends. An instructive example of mainline Christian Zionism, Wagner continues, was the respected liberal theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, praised by former US President Barack Obama as a mentor and his favorite ethical philosopher. Niebuhr's Christian Zionism was not based on end-time pre-millennialist theology, but on his personal commitment to the Jewish state and Zionist ideology as a moral response to the Holocaust. Niebuhr was active as a lobbyist, journalist, and influential international theologian, using his platform to leverage the Roosevelt and Truman administrations on behalf of a Jewish state in Palestine. Niebuhr excused the Israeli militias and army's aim of ethnically cleansing Palestinians, along with its attendant savagery, as the price necessary for there to be a Jewish state. Finally, a couple of notes from non-Zionist mainstream Christianity. First, Palestinian Christians have been in Palestine, as we've said, for 2,000 years. They're a bit nonplussed when Western Christians ask them when they converted to Christianity. They've been there from the beginning. Secondly, in the Christian calendar, all Christians are now in the season of Advent, a 4-week anticipation of Christmas. The Song of Mary is foremost in their hearts. She sings, "The Savior God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich God has sent away empty." This God of justice, I believe, is at the heart and hope of the church, of which Jesus is the key to understanding. There you have it.
If that's terrific, and appreciate your taking us through territory that's not as familiar as even the Palestinian and the Jewish narrative. So thank you. At least for me. We did want to speak a little bit about the Quaker response, and I'm sorry, but I'm forgetting if that's Deb or Joan.
That's Deb.
That's
Deb's
me.
gonna do the history.
I'll just, because we've geared this largely to Quakers and want to sort of make us aware of, for the Quakers in the group, our sort of context and connection. This is a very brief history of Quakers in the Holy Land. For the non-Quakers, Quakerism began in the mid-1600s in England, so we're relative newbies compared to the start of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. By the mid-1600s, Quakers were also present in colonial North America. So the spread westward was pretty darn quick. By the mid-1800s, US Quakers have a presence in Palestine. Remember back to what Winnie gave us on some of the history, Palestine in the mid-1800s was part of the Ottoman Empire. It's before the formation of the State of Israel. But you do have some Jews starting to emigrate in small numbers to that area as they are experiencing persecution in Eastern Europe. A couple of highlights. In 1869, Quakers founded a school in Ramallah to educate girls. It was followed by the founding of a school at the turn of the century to educate boys. Those two schools merged in the 1990s to become Ramallah Friends School, which has an enrollment now of around 1,400 students. Much of the work of Quakers in the region in the 20th century in Israel, Palestine is shaped by the two world wars. The American Friends Service Committee helped Jews flee from the Nazis in Europe. and then mounted a monumental relief and reconstruction effort after World War II. Remember the Mandate period. Following the end of the British Mandate in Palestine, the American Friends Service Committee was asked by the United Nations to serve as the municipal commissioner for Jerusalem under that two-state partition plan. So that sort of international city that Winnie had mentioned, sort of AFSC, they were kind of supposed to be the mayors. Additionally, the AFSC was asked by the UN to be the lead agency in Gaza, providing support to Palestinian refugees from the Nakba, as the Palestinians know it. That's the War of Independence, as Israelis will know it. At the time, the American Friends Service Committee said that justice and peace would only come through a political settlement. In the face of the ongoing conflict and wars, the American Friends Service Committee produced 3 books identifying key elements of the conflict and articulating ways forward to resolution of the conflict through truth and reconciliation. The first, in 1970, was The Search for Peace in the Middle East. The second, A Compassionate Peace, A Future for Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, was published in 1982, revised and updated in 1989. The third, When the Rain Returns, Toward Justice and Reconciliation in Palestine and Israel, in 2004. And the American Friends Service Committee continues to provide support for Gaza, and it continues to provide support for Palestinians in other means and ways as well. It's providing some support for the BDS movement. That history is not one I compiled. I will give my thanks to Jonathan Evans, who is a Quaker and former Friends Committee on National Legislation staffer and former staff of Catholic Relief Services. And he and his family lived in Jerusalem for a number of years while he worked there. And back to you, Sandy.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm sorry, because I don't know who is who and who is whom. And I don't know all of your faith connections. I did look over the registrant list and it was listed there, but I didn't commit it all to memory. So if we have folks from any other faith, especially Presbyterians, I would say, who we know have been involved so much in publishing the book on which the content of this course is based, would like to comment also on the presence of your faith community or your work. And you can do it in about 30 or 40 seconds. We'd be glad to hear from you. Raise your hand again electronically, please. And I think I can call on you if I see a raised hand. I don't know if Dana Fisher-Ashrawi is still here. Bennett, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Roman Catholic myself, but I'm a member of a Lutheran Catholic Church in Beaverton, Oregon, with a very active Holy Land ministry team. And we have done a lot of work, a lot of education around Christian Zionism and a number of other topics. So good to be here.
Well, thank you very much for being part of this, and glad to have you introduce yourself. Continued best wishes, of course, with the work that you're involved in. Thank you. Dana Fisher-Ashrawi was with us. I'm not sure that she still is.
She shared in the comments section that she had in the chat that she had to leave early, and she looks forward to returning later.
All right. Well, she's Unitarian Universalist Vice President of their Justice in the Middle East program, or a national program. Do I have that right, Alex? You're nodding your head, so I'll take that as correct. Do we have other comments from other faith communities that would like to say, especially what's the work either that you're involved in, or especially the work that's on the ground in Israel, Palestine. Friends, we have 10 minutes before our allotted end. Am I forgetting about some other stuff? There's a little bit of ending, but I think I should say that you've heard these three strong statements of narrative. We believe that this course focuses on human rights and steps back from the traditional viewpoints, of all three of those narratives that were presented by Kathy and Winnie and Cliff, to center on the experience of the Palestinians and to lift up some of these issues that you've heard about: settler colonialism, flat out racism, discrimination. The Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church of the USA, in writing the book Why Palestine Matters, has offered a fresh and wide angle and global perspective, and that's what we're going to be bringing to you. It demonstrates how the commitment to global human rights crosses paths not only with the Palestinians, but with issues that we face right here in the United States, the African Americans, especially since Ferguson in 2015. The Black Lives Matter have a comment or a bullet point about the Palestinian human rights in their platform. And then the history that's even much longer that we faced is what several of those speakers alluded to about the U.S. colonialism and almost genocide, I guess you'd say, of the indigenous Americans. And so our first class in January will talk a lot about that intersectionality, the connecting the dots from indigenous Americans and what they've experienced, and African Americans and the Palestinians. Again, you guys have done a whole lot of listening tonight, and I thank you. It will not be that way in future nights. We will have breakout groups. We will have times for reflection and conversations. But I appreciate your sticking with us. If anybody wants to ask a question of any of us in the next about 5 minutes, we have time to do that. Put your electronic yellow raised hand.
Louise, I see your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to partially answer the other question about my background, but I want to thank you for, I think the maps and the discussion of the land and the 3 hours are absolutely wonderful. I mean, I really thank you for this session. And I first became involved with Christian Jewish Allies by taking the course Steadfast Hope at the Unitarian Society of Germantown. I think that was 2016. And I always feel like in CJ Allies, everybody else must know a lot more about Palestine than I do. So I was shy about asking to join the course since I go to the meetings every month, but this is very wonderful so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Carolyn McCoy?
There was a lot to take in. I'm just wondering if any of the narratives that were shared with us tonight would be available for us to read later in written form, because that would be helpful to me. I take in things when I hear them, but I take them in more securely when I read them. And if the speakers could put those in written form and share those with us, that would be really helpful.
We'll have discussions in our planning group about that, Carol, and I should think it would be possible. And Scott, why don't you take the lead here?
Yes. One thing that might be very helpful right now is for us to have a one-word checkout from each person. Just a one-word sense from everyone who's gathered here tonight, just that helps clarify where we are as a group by each person saying one thing.
I'm glad to go right around hairpin turn across my full Zoom screen. So Louise, you're first. One word.
I just gave a lot of words. Clarification.
Excellent. Benneth in Portland.
Hopeful.
Alex, I don't even know if you're in Washington or Philadelphia or Texas.
I'm in Washington and engaged.
Thank you, Alex. Olivia, you can have a chance.
Thank you. Open.
Winnie. One word, Winnie. Are you there? Maybe she's frozen.
It's very slow.
Tony.
It looks
Thank you. Deb.
appreciative.
Susan.
Grateful.
Susan Rodewald. Great. Scott.
Grateful.
And continuing education.
Joan. Broadfield.
Wow.
Karen.
Informative.
Stephanie. You're muted, dear.
Anticipatory.
Thank you. Eileen.
Overwhelmed. There's two Eileens. I hope I'm the right one.
Eileen Redden.
Yeah, that's
Sorry.
me.
Cliff.
I think equality.
Lori Leak.
I'm learning.
Excellent. Helena Bew.
Comforted to be among all of you.
Susan Betts. You have to unmute, Susan. Oh, I'm not seeing it. There you go.
Hi. Illuminating.
Great. Christy Duncan Tesmer.
Reminded.
Rick Alfred Chase.
Striving.
Arthur Larrabee.
Challenged.
Carolyn.
Comprehensive.
Morgan Wilson.
Thoughtful.
Crystal Jorgensen.
Heart-centered.
Joe Bronski.
Insight.
Thank you. Joe Marchese.
Humbled.
Where are we here? Barbara Smith.
Possibilities.
Eileen Best.
Looking forward to the discussions.
Winnie. Are you there?
Grateful.
Great. Thank you. And Jim Best.
Dissemination to my other Quaker meetings that don't have any clue what we're here for.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm excited, and I'm totally appreciative of having all of you as part of
Did
this.
we hear from Sue?
Did we hear from Sue? Sue, sorry.
It's okay. I also overwhelmed.
Sandy, there was one more thing.
All right, go for it.
We were thinking along the Quaker lines. We were encouraged by Susan Landau to share from our Quaker roots, and so giving a personal testimony from a Quaker view, what as we think about these different aspects. And we know our lives speak, our lives can testify to our values, our conditions, and we would hope our faith. We seek to follow the calling, as Fox said, to be patterns, examples, that we travel and live among all, and that this life will speak to people as we answer to that of God in each of us, and thus be a blessing, being a witness to that of God in them, which will bless us. And we are not perfect. At our best, we pay attention, seek and act for justice and love for the building of our beloved community. Deb, did you want to add anything?
Friend speaks my mind. I mean, that's walk cheerfully looking for that of God in everyone, so it brings it out in you. And for me, that speaks very much to if I know there's a justice someplace, how can I walk cheerfully if I'm not doing something to bring it into justice?
And we also are reminded of the line from Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.